Hello and welcome back for another Torah Tuesday. We have reached the end of Leviticus. Today we're going to be talking about Leviticus chapters 26 and 27, and it will close out this series. Chapter 26 sets up the rewards and punishments, and it may seem random, but it's a fitting conclusion to a book of ritual instructions. It also ties in directly with the previous chapter's focus on sacred space and sacred time. So let me show you how. Chapter 26 begins with two instructions or two laws. Verse 1 says not to make idols or set up an image or carved stone for yourselves. If they set up idols, it will defile the land. It will defile sacred space, the land that God has given them to possess, which we've just been reading about in chapter 25. Verse 2 says, observe my Sabbaths and have reverence for my sanctuary. So this reminder to observe the Sabbaths ties in with all of the different Sabbath-related regulations we've just been reading about in chapters 23 and 25, and it's a call to honor sacred time. So sacred space and sacred time, here are the consequences. Here are the rewards for honoring them and the consequences for not honoring sacred space and sacred time. God has great blessings in store for those who take His presence seriously. Check out verses 11 through 13. I will put my dwelling place among you, and I will not abhor you. I will walk among you and be your God, and you will be my people. I am Yahweh your God, who brought you out of Egypt so that you would no longer be slaves to the Egyptians. I broke the bars of your yoke and enabled you to walk with heads held high. Whatever this book has been, all these different ritual instructions, it has not been a new ball and chain, a new form of slavery. It is the prescription for life in freedom with God moving into the neighborhood. This is the recipe for a peaceful coexistence with God, for a flourishing covenant relationship with Him. But if the people don't take this book seriously, if they don't take the instructions seriously, then God's presence among them becomes a threat. It becomes a terror. And so verses 14 and following describe the lengths to which God will go to get their attention and restore them. It's a brutal list of what God will do. And each paragraph begins with, if after all this you won't listen to me, if you remain hostile toward me and refuse to listen to me, in spite of all these things, if you do not accept my instruction but continue to be hostile. So God is going to go through a series of ways to get their attention. And if nothing works, then the last step is in verse 33. I will scatter you among the nations and will draw out my sword and pursue you. Your land will be laid waste and your cities will lie in ruins. The result of that is in verse 34, and it's another tie-in to chapter 25. Then the land will enjoy its Sabbath years. All the time it lies desolate and you are in the country of your enemies. Then the land will rest and enjoy its Sabbaths. So if you don't obey God's instruction to let your land rest every 7 years, then eventually I'm going to have to remove you so that the land will get its rest. So you can see how the punishment fits the crime. But if we continue on, verse 40 and following demonstrates how simple it is to be restored in our relationship with God. It says very simply, if they will confess their sins and the sins of their ancestors, their unfaithfulness and their hostility toward me, then He will remember His covenant and He will be faithful to them. It doesn't remove the consequences of their sin, but it restores them to the place of experiencing God's blessing and being able to be in His presence again. If you have been ignoring God, walking in your own way, being rebellious against what you know He asks of you, no matter how far you've gone, the trip back to God, the trip back to being restored to God is only one step. It's the step of repentance. God calls His people to name their sin in His presence so that they can experience the blessing of restored relationship with Him. Sometimes people debate about whether the Israelite covenant is conditional or unconditional. That is this thing going to be around forever, or is there a chance of it being abrogated or set aside? I think it's clear from this chapter and from many other places in the Old Testament that the covenant is eternal. God has decreed his intention to bless all nations through the family of Abraham. That is sure. What changes is whether we experience the blessings or the consequences of that covenant. When we walk faithfully with God, we experience the blessings that he has in store for us. But when we reject God's commands, it doesn't bring an end to the covenant. It just means we experience the dark side of things. We experience the unpleasant consequences of being at odds with God, of having God as our enemy. Chapter 27 is a postscript to the entire book. It's a final speech regarding how to dedicate something to Yahweh. It's a fitting conclusion for a book in which holiness has been the central concern. The people are to dedicate their whole lives to Yahweh. And the book is showing us what that looks like in this ancient Israelite context. Of course, with the coming of Jesus in the New Testament, things have changed. Ritual purity laws have been set aside because we no longer have a temple or tabernacle where we need to go worship God's presence with sacrifices. Jesus' sacrifice is once for all. So ritual laws are set aside, but the importance of honoring God's moral commands remains today. If we are a people who truly fear God, who truly live our lives in acknowledgement of his sovereignty, then we will want to honor God with our lives. And the Bible gives us lots of ways to do that. Jesus came not to set aside the law, but to demonstrate for us what it would look like to fulfill it. He himself lived his life in obedience to God's commands, providing a model for us. So that brings us to the end of Leviticus, a neglected book with such rich teaching for what it means to live life in God's presence. Now that this series is done, you can binge Leviticus and binge Torah Tuesday and share it with your friends. Perhaps you haven't noticed yet, but on my YouTube channel, we now have playlists for all the Torah Tuesday videos that pertain to each book. So there's a Leviticus playlist, a Genesis playlist, an Exodus playlist, and a Psalms playlist so far. We'll continue to add to that in months and years to come, but for now, if this study has been interesting to you, if you've benefited from it, consider sharing it with your friends, with your small group, with your church family. If you have a Bible study, maybe you could tackle the book of Leviticus and you could lead off each week with the Torah Tuesday video for your group. If you decide to do that, I'd love to hear about it. Have a great week.